A report by Human Rights Watch says airstrikes by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in Libya last year killed dozens of civilians, including women and children. The report accuses NATO of failing to acknowledge those deaths and says the military alliance hasn't investigated them. Can NATO be sued and held accountable for killing civilians? Is there an international mechanism to help the victims of war? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to Inside Story. I'm Stephen Cole. A leading human rights organisation is accusing NATO of failing to investigate the deaths of dozens of civilians in Libya last year. The people were killed by air attacks designed to push Muammar Gaddafi out of power. The report by Human Rights Watch examines in detail 8 separate NATO strikes. The attacks killed 72 civilians, including 20 women and 24 children. NATO says it conducted the air campaign with unprecedented care and precision and to a standard exceeding that required by international humanitarian law. Well, Human Rights Watch says it has evidence that there wasn't a clear military target at 7 of the 8 sites mentioned in the report. The group called on NATO to investigate those attacks and to report its findings to the UN Security Council, which authorises the military intervention in Libya. But NATO says it's now looked into each credible allegation of harm to civilians and confirmed that the attack sites were what it calls legitimate military targets, selected in a manner consistent with the UN mandate. So, can NATO be sued and held accountable for killing civilians? To answer this question, we're joined by our guests. In London, David Mepham, UK Director of Human Rights Watch. In Amsterdam, Olivier Ribbelink, Senior Researcher at the TMC Assa Institute, the Centre for International and European Law. And in Geneva, Alexander Votravers, Professor of International Relations at Webster University and Editor of the Swiss Military Review. Welcome to all three of you. But first to David Mepham in London. David, NATO has told us the targets in Libya were all legitimate and were selected in a manner that it says was consistent with the UN mandate. So NATO's saying the targets were lawful.
Well, the report that Human Rights Watch has just produced, which is on this very issue, raises big concerns and big questions about that, which we feel that NATO has yet to answer satisfactorily. What we did was we had people on the ground in Libya, unlike NATO. We went to all of the sites, the 8 sites in which civilians died as a result of NATO military action. We investigated the scene, we talked to people that were there at the time, we looked at the damage that was done, we looked at photographic evidence, we looked at satellite imagery subsequently. And the conclusion that we reach is that of 7 of the 8 sites that were hit, there does not appear to have been military activity at the time that the strikes took place, which raises big questions as to whether or not these were legitimate military targets. At the very least, we would say there's an obligation on NATO to come clean, to be public, to be transparent about the rationale for these particular attacks, which, as I say, do not appear to have been related to military activity at the time that they took place.
Olivier, NATO says the campaign was conducted with what it calls unprecedented care and precision and to a standard exceeding that required by humanitarian law. That's the quote. What is the standard?
Well, the standard has already been hinted at by the previous speaker. Before attacking a military target, the attacker must be convinced and absolutely certain that it is an actual legitimate military target and not a civilian target, or that no civilians are in the area. In that situation, a strike, an attack must be cancelled or must be aborted if it's already on its way. NATO claims indeed that they have checked and been unprecedentedly careful. In fact, Human Rights Watch in its report also admits that this has been an exceptional campaign in the sense that so many attacks have been conducted and with relatively few, very little civilian casualties. But that indeed does not take away the necessity to investigate those cases where things apparently have been misjudged or could have been misjudged, as these 8 cases may suggest the cases that Human Rights Watch brings forward in its report.
Alexandra, NATO says it flew a total of 26,000 sorties in Libya, including 9,500, NATO says 9,700 strike missions, destroying almost 6,000 targets. Given that high number of missions, are accidental deaths of civilians likely, especially, of course, when Gaddafi started to use human shields?
Well, first of all, if we're talking about over 7,600 projectiles, there's bound to be a certain number that will either malfunction or fall afar from the target. And I think the Human Rights Report actually does point out to one such case of a GPS receiver malfunctioned. Those kinds of things can happen. I would like to say that the report certainly underlines the fact that great restraint has been shown, in particular with compliance with the rules of engagement and international humanitarian law. I'll just quote a couple of ways in which NATO took extra care. One of them is by calibrating its weapons, and over 82% of the weapons that were used were relatively small caliber munitions, and occasionally only larger weapons were used, therefore reducing the amount of collateral damage. The very vast majority of weapons were guided with a very good precision. This indeed, I think, is the reference to international humanitarian law. Rare are the operations in which such high percentages of weapons are actually precision-guided munition, and of course this has a cost to the participating countries. I'll just give you one last example. France, in particular, even used concrete bombs that are basically practice weapons that are non-explosive in order to take out a certain number of positions and armored vehicles in Libya, thereby even further reducing the amount of collateral damage. So I think that a lot of effort has gone into reducing this amount of collateral damage.
NATO's action in Libya is the latest in a series of accusations of bombing inaccuracies which have raised some doubts about its operations. Last week, 20 civilians in Afghanistan, including a mother and her 5 children, were killed in 2 separate NATO airstrikes in southern Helmand and northwestern Baghdis provinces. In 1999, Human Rights Watch accused NATO of killing hundreds of civilians in 90 separate airstrikes in Kosovo during its 78-day campaign against Serbia. And the alleged mistakes were not limited to civilians. Last November, a NATO airstrike killed 24 Pakistani soldiers near the Afghan border. The attack created a lot of tension between NATO and Pakistan's government. So, still tension between NATO and Pakistan. But back to Libya. Oana Lungesco is NATO's spokeswoman in Brussels. Oana, because NATO flew so many missions in Libya, thousands of missions, 9,500 strike missions, does NATO feel that, to some degree, collateral damage will be inevitable in those conditions?
We flew indeed over 9,700 sorties in a campaign which lasted 7 months. And that campaign was carried out with great precision, with utmost care. It was the first campaign in history where only precision-guided munition was used. In any military campaign, the risk to civilians, unfortunately, can never be zero, but we did our very best, as much as we could in human and technical terms, to minimize those risks to civilians. And at the core of our mission, which had a United Nations mandate, was the protection of civilians.
In Afghanistan, NATO has apologized for the bombing of civilians. Is that apology a likely prelude to compensation for the victims' families?
The situation in Afghanistan and the situation in Libya and our operations are very different. In Afghanistan, we've got around 130,000 international troops on the ground and have done so for many years. In Libya, of course, our mandate was very clear that we would have no presence on the ground, and we had no presence on the ground either during the operation, which was completed on the 31st of October last year, nor indeed after it. What we have said very clearly is that we have reviewed all the information that we have as NATO. Some allies are still continuing to review the information that they have, and we have communicated very clearly all the information we had, much of it had to be declassified, to the international bodies that have been following the aftermath of the Libyan conflict. That information is in the public domain, and moreover, importantly, we have communicated very clearly to the Libyan authorities that we stand ready to help and cooperate with them in whatever review they deem necessary into such incidents.
So is that saying that NATO will investigate the incident in which 72 civilians died in Libya?
NATO has already reviewed all the information that we have during our campaign, and we have also declassified a lot of that information. That information is on the internet. Anybody can consult it, so you can see the amount of care that was taken throughout the operation to minimize any harm to civilians. This was an operation in which 2/3 of the possible targets were taken off the list because there was a possibility of harming civilians. Also, hundreds of strikes were aborted at the very last minute, either because there was perhaps a car going down a road or a football match going somewhere happening in the vicinity. So it was an operation where unprecedented care and precision was taken. Our mandate was to protect civilians, and that's exactly what we did. And that was also what the Libyan authorities told us at the end of the campaign. The chairman of the National Transitional Council told the Secretary General, you took very great care to protect civilians, and we can testify to that care.
Whose responsibility is it, Oana? Is it NATO's responsibility to try and find some compensation for the families of the people who are killed?
As I said, we stand ready to cooperate with the Libyan authorities who have communicated to the United Nations Security Council that they intend to review any incidents where civilians may have been harmed. As we fully cooperated with the International Commission of Inquiry in Libya earlier this year, which concluded that NATO had conducted a highly precise campaign with a demonstrable determination to protect civilians, we stand ready to work together with the Libyan authorities going forward. Afterwards, it is their country, and the mission that we conducted was to protect countless of lives and also to make sure that Libyans would once again have full control over their future and their country.
Oana, many thanks to you for joining us from Brussels. I'm most grateful to you.
You're welcome.
David, almost half the number of fatalities died in one incident in the village of Major Maya, 160 kilometres east of Tripoli. 34 civilians died in that incident. What conclusions did Human Rights Watch come after that?
Well, the Major case that you've just referred to is a very concerning one. As you say, nearly half of the fatalities that we document occurred in this village. And what happened was there was a series of strikes by NATO on a number of residential compounds in that village. So they didn't just hit once, they hit on a series of strikes. The first strike led to fatalities. There was then 4 people that were killed on the second strike. And the very worrying thing is that then there was a third strike in which a further 18 people were killed. It seems to me very improbable that someone responsible for making that strike wouldn't have had the technology to see that very large numbers of civilians were on the ground and moving around at the scene of the target. So I think there are big questions for NATO to answer about what happened in Major, as a strike which, as you say, a series of strikes that led to 34 deaths, including the deaths of 5 children. Now, what Human Rights Watch has done in our report is to actually name those 34 people. What NATO has failed to do up to this point is to either go there and actually investigate on the ground, as we have done, or to come up with some alternative figure of its own. If it thinks that 34 is not right, then tell us what the figure is. Or presumably the other possibility is they're saying that somehow these 34 people were connected to Gaddafi's forces. If that's their argument, then they should present their evidence, because The evidence that we have, that was meticulously put together on the basis of extensive interviews with people on the scene, was that these were 34 civilians. They were not Gaddafi fighters, they were civilians. And I think there are big questions for NATO still to answer.
Olivier, is the big question here accountability? In other words, who is NATO accountable to?
Good question. NATO, of course, is an international organization, intergovernmental organization with member states. And as we have seen, for example, after the Kosovo bombings in 1999, Serbia could not bring forward claims against NATO, but had to do so against 10 NATO states, and when they went to the International Court of Justice. So in that sense, they will investigate or can investigate or start proceedings, whatever, against the individual NATO states that have participated in the bombing campaign in Libya. NATO, as an international organization, is bound to have immunities before national courts, especially the national courts, of course, of the NATO member states. So that is a problem. But if I may come back to what was said before, Mr. Alexander already indicated the care that several countries have taken to minimize the casualties. The problem, of course, is always how to make the decisions. A distinction between legitimate targets, military targets, and non-legitimate civilian targets is extremely crucial. But in some situations, in exceptional situations, military necessity may overrule even the possibility of having casualties, despite, of course, there's always a proportionality issue. And these are the
these are the
main
difficult
issues.
decisions, of course. These are the difficult decisions
Yes,
being
the very
taken
difficult decisions
during
before,
wartime.
but also later.
But what I'm trying to get at is legal responsibility here. I'm talking about accountability. I'm wondering, could you ever foresee a time when anybody in NATO is referred to the ICC? That
would only be possible if such a person, for example, would have the nationality of an ICC member state, a state that is a party to the ICC statute. That could perhaps in a given situation, but of course only when the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court decides that such is necessary. And then again, the Security Council, which its specific mandate in Security Council Resolution 1970-1973, the Security Council, according to the ICC statute, would also have the possibility to stop such an investigation.
Alexandra, we talk about the rules of engagement, and we know that very precise weapons are used whenever possible. So when civilians get killed, would you basically say that's a mistake?
A mistake. Let me say that we've heard a lot of very important things, and one of them is certainly the different principles of international humanitarian law. We've heard of the principle of discrimination, the principle of proportionality and military need. Lower to that echelon, we have operations orders that may come from NATO or may come from member states, and essentially what these orders, or if these orders are at fault, the responsible party will be the member state, and so are the rules of engagement that you just mentioned now. These rules of engagement are essentially drafted by the member states, and therefore the jurisdiction is a national jurisdiction.
David Mepham, we've just heard from NATO, who's told me that it's ready to cooperate with the new Libyan authorities. Does that satisfy Human Rights Watch?
It doesn't, actually. I was in an exchange with the NATO spokeswoman this morning, actually, on a different programme, and I said that I thought the NATO argument was frankly a bit feeble, if not disingenuous, to say that NATO can't conduct an investigation because it doesn't have people on the ground, and it doesn't appear to have asked the permission of the new Libyan government to go and investigate at the sites. I mean, if Human Rights Watch can actually go to these sites and carry out investigations, why is it really beyond the wit and the capacity of NATO to do that? And to say, well, we're waiting on the Libyans, and if the Libyans ask us, we will provide information, doesn't strike me as defensible. I mean, basically, NATO carried out these attacks. It did so under UN mandate, that's true, but NATO, it seems to me, has an obligation to investigate to see whether or not civilians were killed unnecessarily as a result of its actions. And it just doesn't stand up to say, we'll only do that if the Libyans want us to do it. I think NATO should be requesting proactively the opportunity to investigate for its own purposes as well as everything else, to actually know what happened as a result of its strategy. You would think that NATO would want to learn those lessons if mistakes have been made in this particular case.
Alexandra, you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to say that I'm extremely sure that these investigations within NATO and within the member states are taking place. There's a process for this. It's called battle damage assessment, and I'm sure that every country that has participated in these efforts is really looking or investigating at every one of these mistakes, alleged mistakes, or errors of functioning of the munitions, of the weapons, in order to improve. If we look over a period of 15 or 20 years, several people have talked about Kosovo. Well, we have come a long way since Kosovo. So I'm sure that all of these studies are taking place. I am just not sure that the result of these studies and lessons learned will necessarily be publicized, because they may put in jeopardy a certain number of people on the ground.
Well, the current theatre of
Sorry,
war
could I come in? Sorry.
Yes,
could I come in on that point? Because actually that's not what NATO
is
is saying. NATO is saying they can't verify. The NATO spokeswoman this morning said, we can't verify civilian casualties because we don't have the mandate to be on the ground. So she's saying something slightly different, which is not that these investigations are taking place. She's saying we don't have the mandate to do that.
What she told Al Jazeera is that she has handed documents over to the Libyans, and she's willing to take part in an investigation. But I want to talk about the current theatre of war, Afghanistan. After being pressured by the government there, NATO and the US military apologised to the families of Afghans killed this month in coalition airstrikes in 2 villages. A statement from NATO's International Security Assistance Force said, "Unfortunately, the preliminary investigation into these events have determined that our actions have resulted in a number of deaths and injuries to Afghan civilians." NATO added, "The coalition takes full responsibility for these tragic and regrettable incidents, and we will meet with the family members of those who died or were injured to express our sincere condolences." Olivier, is that an admission of guilt? Could that lead to legal action and possible compensation for the families?
Well, that depends. It has been mentioned several times already. There can be mistakes, there can be legitimate mistakes even, when the decision has been taken on valid grounds, but that the result of that decision, the result of the strike in this case, turns out to have dramatic effects in the sense that there are many civilian casualties. It may have been a pure decision mistake on somewhere in the process, in the preparation, in the decision on what the intelligence gives on how to do it, what to do it with, etc. But in this case, yes, if it is a mistake and they do apologize, I think that is quite correct to do so, and that should also be, let's say, a reparation, which would also be in place.
This is the key question, and David, very, very briefly indeed, should there be a mechanism that NATO should be able to use to compensate the victims or the families of victims?
Yes. I believe there should be. I mean, the precise format for that needs to be worked through. But it's interesting in the case of Afghanistan that compensation is being paid to many families. Actually, again, the NATO spokeswoman this morning said that wasn't necessarily what they were going to do in relation to Libya. I see no reason why not. Basically, compensation should be paid to the families of the victims.
And Alexander, is that possible, do you think?
Yes, I will just say that the situation, post-conflict situation in Afghanistan is substantially different from the situation in Libya. The overarching principle is, this is not about winning the war, it's about winning the peace.
Alexander, thank you. And thank you to all our guests in London, David Mepham, in Amsterdam, Olivier Ribbelink, and in Geneva, Alexander Vartravers. Questions about bombing inaccuracies will keep being asked for as long as war is fought primarily from the air, which is the likely option for NATO in the foreseeable future. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. From me, Stephen Cole. Goodbye.